And thank you all for joining me today as we engage in today's topic, leading as a woman of color. Again, my name is Nayeli Vivanco, and my pronouns are she, ella, and elle. I want to welcome everyone to this conversation. If you identify as a woman of color or not, thank you for being here. This indeed is a conversation for everyone. See, leadership and all its nuances are difficult to navigate for all of us. Now imagine adding a layer of being a woman, and then on top of that, a woman of color. Someone actually asked me why the title of this talk was Leading as a Woman of Color and not just about leading. Well, my answer was really easy. It's because there's so many added barriers that impact women of color, and it's important to call them out. In preparing for this conversation, I did a lot of self-reflection. I gathered information from studies and various articles. I spoke to fellow women of color and to allies. I might not be an expert in this topic matter, but then again, what is expertise if not lived experiences? With that in mind, I will speak today about my own experiences as a woman of color in a leadership role. I will then dive deeper by looking at relevant data and the landscape for women of color. And to close the talk, we will discuss how we move to action to support women of color. But before we get started, I'd like to just clarify a few of the definitions and the languages that I'll be using. So starting with allyship, what I mean by this is when we use one's privilege to move social justice and inclusion forward. Glass ceiling as a metaphor used to explain an invisible barrier that prevents women and people from underrepresented groups from rising beyond a certain level. The glass cliff, another metaphor used to explain also women and other people from underrepresented groups that actually do break that glass ceiling, but are not set up for success and thus have a higher probability of failure to fall off the glass cliff. Identity, everything and anything that makes you who you are, whether it's seen or unseen, characteristics and traits. Imposter syndrome. Doubting your abilities and feeling like a fraud. It's a form of intellectual self-doubt that comes with anxiety and often depression. Intersectionality, all of a person's identities that overlap and intersect. The stereotype threat, feeling the risk of conforming to negative stereotypes about an individual's racial, ethnic, gender, and cultural group, as also correlated with anxiety. And lastly, women of color. So women of color is a term that is used to identify women who are of a race other than white or of mixed race. And for me, I embrace being a woman of color beyond the color of my skin. So some of you might have heard some of these terms or even experienced these terms, but it's okay if you haven't. That's why we're here today. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I would start with my story, my lived experiences. And I think it's relevant and important to share this because as a woman and a woman of color, a working parent, I hope that if you do share these identities, you can see yourself represented. But for those of you that don't, I hope that I can foster some curiosity for further understanding. Now, my story starts with how I identify. I identify as a Latina, a mother, multilingual, a woman of color, a citizen of the world, a first-generation Mexican American, and some of my personal core values include compassion, being a lifelong learner, and an advocate for social change. I shared with you my identities because these have all shaped my story. It has taken me a long time, and to be quite honest, it's actually a work in progress still, to acknowledge that I get to write my own story, set my own purpose, and create my own legacy. As a first-generation Mexican American woman, the expectations pile up very, very fast. The generational trauma of meeting certain expectations, following a certain career path, making sure that the sacrifices that my parents endured are worth it, taking care of my family, growing my family to continue the legacy, and consistently fighting a patriarchal society embedded in my culture, yet still looking good in red lipstick. To write my own personal story, I needed to first understand what success looked like for me, not the stereotype. Again, mitigating the stereotype threat. So while I sit here and speak endlessly about all the different roads that and experiences that have led to creating my own story, I will share a few defining moments in my career that have actually contributed into changing the narrative. And the first story that I will share was a moment that I realized that I didn't need to settle for a job that didn't fulfill me. I was towards the end of an 8-hour interview in Luxembourg for a very well-established financial institution. During my last interview, the head of the department asked me why I wanted to work in finance. I paused for a minute, and despite my sister's advice to not mention my passion for microfinancing and social work, I mentioned it. I started talking about how I wanted to change the world, have an impact, and be an agent for change. The person interviewing me told me at that moment, Nayeli, thank you for coming today, but I don't think this is a good fit for you. I have to say that a huge weight was lifted off my shoulders. This was the first time I realized the importance of being authentic, my authentic self. If I had chosen not to talk about my real passion, I would have just settled for a job that I wasn't, really interested in, even though it meant not getting a big finance job that would have made my family very proud. So the next story was when I broke my personal glass ceiling and believed wholeheartedly in myself. I left my hometown of 32,000 people to live in a city with a population of 10 million in a country I knew very little about and a language I didn't speak. I say I broke my personal glass ceiling because for a first generation Mexican American woman with no generational wealth, moving to China alone to start a life was a big shift. This decision, however, changed my life. It kickstarted my now 12-year career with an organization that is mission driven and aligns fully with my core values. It has helped me acquire a new language, an understanding for a new culture, and is helping me build generational wealth for my family. The last story that I want to share with you is a time that I had a candid conversation with my boss about my career. I asked for what I wanted and I advocated for myself. It led to my current role where I am living my passion to be an agent for social change. As a woman of color, it has been ingrained to be grateful, grateful for a job and for an opportunity, making it difficult to advocate for oneself and to ask for what we want. But advocating for myself has allowed me to live by experience and support other women of color to also advocate for themselves. I shared these moments because they were not easy. They challenged me, but they also helped me grow and write my own story. These were my experiences, and I acknowledge the privileges that I have had, but I also don't want to undervalue the hard work and sacrifices. See, for a long time, I thought my career advancement had been luck, being at the right place at the right time. But no, it has been hard work and dedication. I took advantage of every opportunity that was presented to me, and I created opportunities for myself. But my story is only one of many. Now I'd like to talk about the context of women of color in leadership. In 2019, women of color comprised of 20.3% of the US population. It is estimated that by 2060, women of color will contribute to 53.4% of the population. Women of color contribute to 1 trillion as consumers and 361 billion in revenues as entrepreneurs. Yet, in 2020, women of color, although representing 18% of entry-level positions, they represent 12% for managers, 9% as senior managers or directors, 6% VP, 5% senior VP, and a near 3% for C-suite level, compared to 19% for white women, 12% for men of color, and 66% of white men. So what's wrong with this context? Women of color are not represented in senior leadership roles, despite their presence and importance to the economy and society. There's a lack of focus and investment for women of color to not only stay in their role, but to advance into leadership roles. According to Catalyst.org, a survey in 2019 showed that 50% of women of color professionals would leave their employer over the next 2 years. Intersectionality of race and gender create a unique barrier for women of color. According to an analysis by the American Association University Women, Black and Hispanic women are only 1/5 likely to be executives. I'd like to also point out that there's very little data available on the representation of Indigenous women in executive roles. Now, these barriers, along with biases, stereotypes, and different forms of oppression, create particular challenges for women of color in leadership. We have some context on the problem. Now let's understand the cause of the problem. And let's just say it's not me, it's you, being the workplace. What do I mean by this? Is that we need to stop putting the burden on the individual, in this case, women of color, period. We need to stop telling women of color to lean in. Michelle Obama said in a sold out stadium, that whole so you can have it all, nope, not at the same time. It's a lie. And it's not always enough to lean in because that doesn't work all the time. We have been leaning in. 83% of Asian women, 80% of Black women, and 76% of Latinas want to be promoted, compared to 75% of men and 68% of white women. Systemic barriers specific to the experiences of women of color have not been taken into account within the concept of leaning in. Instead, we need to look at the gender gap and the racial wealth divide that exists today. We also need to stop telling women they have imposter syndrome. Let me be clear though, I'm not saying imposter syndrome does not exist. It's very real. However, this concept of imposter syndrome fails to account for racism and systemic challenges also presented specifically to women of color. This article by the Harvard Business Review states that telling women that imposter syndrome does not address the root problem, but rather the symptoms of the problem. To quote, we don't need to fix the women that work. Instead, we need to fix the places where women work. And I agree with that. We need to create psychological safety in our work environments to foster an inclusive work environment where diversity of race, ethnicity, gender are valued and understood. To further contextualize the imposter syndrome, I'd like to share my personal experiences with it. I have doubted my abilities and felt like a fraud. As a matter of fact, even when I was asked to give this talk, I thought to myself, am I even capable of that? When I accepted my current role as director of DIB for EF North America, I was so happy. However, that happiness was quickly tainted by massive feelings of, I am way in over my head. I don't have the experience in this field. I focused on all the negatives and not on my contributions. It took some amazing people and advocates to help remind me of who I am and that I didn't get this job by a chance. I had worked very hard for this. Every experience I've had has been a foundation to give me the tools necessary for this job. Now, at the end of the day, women of color can lean in all the way, have ambition, resilience, but we still have to fight daily battles with microaggressions, expectations, and assumptions based on stereotypes, biases, and racism. I cannot sit here and tell you to manage your imposter syndrome because what we actually need to do is stop putting the onus on individuals and let's elevate each other and change the systems of discrimination and biases that have long been embedded in the workplace. So how do we move from allyship to action? The first concept that I want to mention is to acknowledge and embrace differences. Different people succeed differently. Consider how you value differences. Think of your own personal experiences that might influence your perception. Embracing differences helps create an inclusive work environment. Think about what the standard of success looks like. Be aware of your biases and acknowledge that people define success differently. How boring would it be if success was the same cookie cutter mold for everyone? If you're a manager, are you assessing potential, not just competencies? Consider that the person you're assessing might have not had an equitable access to opportunities that have given them the competencies that you're looking for. The second concept is Understanding what inequality in the workplace looks like. Why do people feel they have no credibility? Consider the individual's experiences, the work environment. Have they played an active role in fostering psychological safety for people to feel safe, to speak up, and to ask questions? Why do people experience this stereotype threat? Are there specific situations or systems in place fostering, perpetuating stereotypes and biases? Ask yourself, are people included in influential networks? Giving people exposure supports retention, development, and advancement. How are you connecting people? Are people given critical leadership experiences? This one also goes back to equitable access to opportunities. We can't just say this person has no experience in X, Y, or Z. Instead, ask, have we given this person that opportunity to gain that experience? Overall, think about your role in the system that maintains the barriers, the biases, the stereotypes, and discrimination that women of color face every day in the workplace. Here are some very specific actions that you can take to support women of color. The very first one is don't stay quiet. If you see a woman of color experiencing a microaggression, step in and stand up. Do the work to understand women of color experiences. Be curious, read, ask, learn. Don't assume without understanding. Be part of organizational change. Lead by example in fostering an inclusive work environment. And go beyond mentoring women of color. Sponsor them. What does this mean? It means actively help them get ahead in their career. Recommend them from that promotion. In the end, I hope that what you can take from today's talk is that for you, ally, be an agent of change. Don't let the workplace continue placing the onus on individuals. For women, empower women, empower women. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you support other women. And for you, women of color, be unapologetically yourself. Write your own story and change the narrative. I want to leave you with this word, Ubuntu, which is Zulu for I am because we are. It's a philosophy that I aspire to live by because in the end, we all are interconnected. And remember that elevating others is elevating you. Thank you so much for listening and for being here today.